Undercover single dad found a pregnant girl crying at a gas station, unaware she was a CEO millionaire. Scott's instincts screamed that something was wrong as he watched the pregnant woman sitting alone in the rain, her expensive clothes and desperate tears creating a puzzle that didn't fit the rough neighborhood surrounding them. He approached with the careful steps of someone trained to read danger, but as their eyes met and he offered his hand, neither the undercover cop nor the millionaire CEO realized they were about to save each other in ways that had nothing to do with the storm raging around them. The rain hammered Houston's east side with the relentless intensity of a Gulf Coast storm, turning the truck stop's parking lot into a maze of puddles that reflected neon signs and headlights in fractured patterns. Scott Turner sat in his unmarked Crown Victoria, watching the steady stream of 18-wheelers that used this location as a hub for operations he'd been tracking for 3 months without success. At 35, Scott possessed the kind of weathered alertness that came from years of undercover work in situations where a single mistake could be fatal. His dark hair was deliberately unkempt, his jacket chosen to suggest blue-collar work rather than law enforcement, his entire appearance calibrated to blend into environments where cops were unwelcome. But beneath the carefully constructed exterior lay the constant tension of a single father whose dangerous job required him to become someone else while never forgetting who he really was. His phone buzzed with a text from his neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez. "Emma's asleep. Don't worry about pickup time. I know your work is unpredictable. She's safe." Scott smiled despite his fatigue. Emma was the bright spot in a life that had been redefined by loss. His wife Sarah's death from cancer 2 years ago had transformed him from a married detective into a single father learning to balance law enforcement with lunchbox preparation, surveillance operations with school plays, the dangerous streets of Houston with the fierce protectiveness that governed every decision he made about his daughter's well-being. Through the rain-streaked windshield, he watched the truck stop's usual cast of characters: long-haul drivers grabbing coffee and diesel fuel, night shift workers stopping for energy drinks, the occasional suspicious meeting that might or might not be connected to the drug distribution network he'd been investigating. After 8 hours of observation, Scott was beginning to think tonight would be another dead end in a case that had already consumed too much of his time away from Emma. That's when he noticed her. A young woman sat on the concrete divider between gas pumps, rain soaking through clothes that looked expensive even from 50 yards away. Her posture spoke of exhaustion that went deeper than physical tiredness, and even at this distance, Scott could see the unmistakable evidence of pregnancy in her silhouette. Everything about the scene was wrong. This wasn't the kind of neighborhood where well-dressed pregnant women sat alone at 2 a.m. and her body language suggested distress that went beyond being caught in the rain. Scott's cop instincts, honed by 15 years of reading situations that could turn deadly, were screaming that he was witnessing either a crime in progress or someone in genuine danger. Across the parking lot, Latasha Hawkins felt her world continuing to collapse with each raindrop that soaked through her designer maternity dress. 3 hours ago, she'd been in her downtown office reviewing quarterly reports that showed Hawkins' logistics on track for its most profitable year since she'd founded the company at 22. Now she sat in a truck stop that represented everything she'd fought to escape from, the kind of place where she'd spent hungry nights as a teenager, aging out of foster care, before determination and intelligence had lifted her into boardrooms where her success was measured in millions. The phone call from her assistant had been the first domino to fall. "Ms. Hawkins, I'm sorry to call so late, but Meridian Shipping just terminated their contract. They're claiming breach of service standards, but their lawyers won't specify what standards were allegedly breached. Meridian Shipping represented 40% of Hawkins' logistics revenue. Losing them would force massive layoffs and potentially bankrupt the company she'd built through 16-hour days and relentless focus on being better than competitors who'd had generational wealth and family connections to smooth their paths." The second call had come 20 minutes later from board member Harrison Wells. "Latasha, I'm calling as a courtesy. The board has scheduled an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning to discuss your performance as CEO. Given your condition and the recent contract losses, there are concerns about your ability to maintain the company's leadership standards. The euphemism was clear. Her pregnancy was being used as grounds to question her competence, despite the fact that she'd grown the company from a single delivery truck to a fleet of over 200 vehicles while expanding into 3 states. But the call that had driven her to this rain-soaked parking lot had come from David, the man whose child she was carrying, whose proposal had seemed like the completion of a perfect life just 4 months ago. "Tasha, I can't do this anymore," he'd said, his voice carrying the particular tone of someone who'd rehearsed difficult words. The business problems, the stress, the uncertainty about the company's future. It's not what I signed up for. I thought I was marrying someone successful and stable, not someone whose empire might collapse before our child is born. The words had hit her like physical blows. David had pursued her for over a year, claiming to love her drive and independence, but apparently his love was conditional on her continued financial success. The man she'd trusted with her heart and her future had revealed himself to be another person who saw her net worth before they saw her worth as a human being. So she'd driven through the storm to the one place that reminded her where she'd come from. A truck stop in the neighborhood where she'd once survived by being invisible, before she'd learned to command attention through excellence and determination. The irony wasn't lost on her that success had made her a target for people who wanted to use her resources, while poverty had at least offered the clarity of knowing that anyone who stayed cared about her rather than her money. Scott made the decision that would change both their lives. Abandoning his surveillance position, he grabbed an umbrella from his back seat and approached the woman whose distress had triggered every protective instinct he possessed. "Mom," he called as he got close enough to be heard over the rain. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" Latasha looked up to see a man in his 30s approaching with an umbrella and an expression of genuine concern. Everything about him suggested working-class authenticity: his jacket, his posture, the careful way he approached without crowding her personal space. After hours of being surrounded by people whose interest in her was transactional, his simple offer of help felt like encountering a different species of human being. She began, then stopped, realizing she didn't have a simple answer. Was she okay? She was pregnant, possibly about to lose her company, definitely about to lose the man she'd thought she'd marry, sitting in the rain at a truck stop, while her competitors probably celebrated the news of her potential downfall. "I'm not sure," she said finally, accepting the truth of uncertainty rather than defaulting to the armor of competence she'd worn for so long. Scott extended the umbrella over both of them, noting details that his training had taught him to catalog automatically. Expensive jewelry, designer purse, clothes that suggested wealth despite their rain-soaked condition, posture that spoke of education and authority despite current circumstances. "My name's Scott," he said, offering information about himself before asking questions about her situation. "I work in security, and I've learned to recognize when someone's having the worst day of their life." Something in his tone made Latasha look at him more carefully. There was authority in his voice, but also the kind of empathy that came from personal experience with genuine hardship. Have you ever met someone at exactly the moment when you most needed to remember that kindness existed in the world? Sometimes the people who save us aren't the ones we expect, and the salvation they offer isn't what we think we need. "Latasha," she replied, using the name her foster families had called her rather than the Ms. Hawkins that dominated her professional life. "And you're right. This is definitely the worst day of my life." Scott studied her face, seeing intelligence and strength beneath the exhaustion. Would it help to talk about it? Sometimes just saying the problems out loud makes them feel more manageable. Latasha felt something crack open in her chest, the recognition that she'd been carrying her burdens alone for so long that she'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone offer to listen without wanting something in return. "I don't want to burden you with my problems," she said, testing whether his offer was genuine or just polite social convention. "Ma'am," Scott replied with quiet conviction, "I've got a 7-year-old daughter who's taught me that the most important thing we can do for each other is show up when life gets complicated. Right now you look like someone who needs someone to show up." As they stood together under the umbrella while rain continued to soak the world around them, neither Scott nor Latasha realized they were beginning a conversation that would challenge everything they thought they knew about trust, love, and what it meant to build a family from the wreckage of broken dreams and second chances. The umbrella created an intimate space in the chaos of the storm, sheltering two strangers who were about to discover that sometimes the most important conversations happen in the most unlikely places. Scott guided Latasha toward the covered area near the truck stop's entrance, where fluorescent lights buzzed overhead and the smell of diesel fuel mixed with rain-washed air. "Thank you," Latasha said, settling onto a bench that had seen better decades. "I know this probably isn't how you planned to spend your evening." Scott took a seat beside her, maintaining respectful distance while staying close enough to continue their conversation over the sound of rain drumming against the metal awning. "Actually, I was just sitting in my car watching the world go by. This is definitely more interesting than my original plans." Something in his tone suggested there was more to his presence at the truck stop than casual observation, but Latasha was too emotionally drained to analyze the inconsistencies between his expensive car and working-class appearance. "Can I ask what brought you here tonight?" Scott said gently. "You don't exactly look like someone who frequents truck stops." Latasha laughed, but it carried no humor. "No, I suppose I don't. This place, it reminds me of where I came from. Sometimes when your life falls apart, you need to remember what rock bottom looks like so you can figure out how to climb back up." Scott heard layers in her response that suggested a story more complex than he'd initially assumed. "Sounds like you've had some practice with climbing back up." "More than I'd like," Latasha replied, her hand unconsciously moving to rest on her pregnant belly. "I grew up in foster care, aged out at 18 with nothing but determination and a high school diploma. Spent some nights in places like this, trying to figure out how to survive until I could build something better." The revelation hit Scott harder than he'd expected. He'd assumed from her appearance that she'd lived a life of privilege, but her words painted a picture of someone who'd fought for every advantage. "And you did build something better?" he asked. "I thought so," Latasha said, her voice carrying the weight of recent disappointments. "I started a logistics company when I was 22. One truck, one client, working 18-hour days to prove I could compete with established businesses that had decades of experience and family connections I'd never have." Scott studied her profile, seeing strength that had been forged through necessity rather than granted through circumstance. "That takes incredible determination." "It took everything I had," Latasha replied. "But it worked. 6 years later, I have over 200 trucks, operations in 3 states, and enough success that I thought I'd finally made it. I thought I'd built something permanent." Thought. Scott caught the past tense. Latasha turned to face him, and for the first time since they'd started talking, her composure cracked completely. "Tonight I learned that success built by one person can be destroyed by other people's decisions. My largest client terminated their contract without explanation. My board of directors is questioning my leadership because I'm pregnant, and they think that makes me weak. And the man whose child I'm carrying just told me he can't handle the stress of my business problems." The words tumbled out like water through a broken dam, carrying pain that had been building for hours. Scott felt his protective instincts surge, not the professional detachment he used in his police work, but the fierce empathy of someone who understood what it meant to face loss while carrying responsibility for someone else's welfare. "He left you?" Scott asked, his voice carrying controlled anger at David's betrayal. "Worse than left," Latasha said bitterly. "He explained that he thought he was marrying someone successful and stable, not someone whose empire might collapse. Apparently his love was conditional on my continued financial performance." Scott felt pieces clicking into place. The expensive clothes, the reference to board meetings and business operations, the way she carried herself despite her current distress. "Latasha, what kind of company do you run?" "Hawkins Logistics," she said, then caught his sharp intake of breath. "You've heard of it?" Scott stared at her with new understanding. Hawkins Logistics was one of Houston's most successful minority-owned businesses, frequently featured in business journals as an example of entrepreneurial excellence. The woman sitting beside him wasn't just successful. She was a millionaire CEO whose rags-to-riches story had made her a local business legend. "I've heard of it," he said carefully. You're Latasha Hawkins, the Latasha Hawkins." "Tonight, I'm just a pregnant woman whose life is falling apart," she replied, with exhausted honesty. "Tomorrow I might not even be that, if my board votes me out and my company collapses." Scott processed this revelation while trying to reconcile the vulnerable woman beside him with the powerful business leader he'd read about in newspapers. Can they do that? Vote you out of your own company? "If they can prove I'm no longer competent to serve as CEO," Latasha said, "and apparently being pregnant while facing business challenges constitutes evidence of incompetence in their minds." The injustice of it made Scott's jaw clench. He'd spent years protecting people from predators who exploited vulnerability, and what Latasha was describing sounded like a different kind of predation. Powerful people using her personal circumstances to seize control of what she'd built. "What about the client who terminated their contract?" he asked. "Any idea why they really pulled out?" Latasha looked at him with surprise. "That's an interesting question. Why would you ask about the real reason?" Scott realized he'd responded like a detective rather than a concerned stranger. "I work in security," he said, which was technically true. "I've learned that when things don't make sense, there's usually more to the story than what appears on the surface." The official reason was breach of service standards, but they won't specify what standards were allegedly breached, Latasha said. "We've never had a service complaint from them. If anything, we've exceeded their delivery requirements consistently for 3 years. "Who benefits if your company fails?" Scott asked, his investigative instincts fully engaged now. "My competitors, obviously, but more immediately my board members who've been pushing for me to step down and install a more traditional leadership structure." Latasha paused, studying Scott's face. "You're asking very sophisticated questions for someone who works in security." Scott felt the weight of his deception, but also the recognition that his training might be exactly what Latasha needed to understand what was happening to her business. "I've worked cases where successful people were targeted by others who wanted what they'd built. Sometimes personal attacks are designed to look like business failures." "You think someone orchestrated this?" "I think the timing is suspicious," Scott replied carefully. "Your largest client terminates without valid explanation, your board calls an emergency meeting, and your fiancé abandons you, all on the same day. That feels coordinated rather than coincidental." Latasha stared at him, pieces of a puzzle she hadn't recognized beginning to shift into new configurations. "If that's true, if someone is deliberately trying to destroy what I've built." "Then you fight back," Scott said firmly. "But you fight smart, with evidence and allies, not just determination." Before Latasha could respond, Scott's phone buzzed with an urgent text from his partner. "Drug shipment arriving at location in 30 minutes. Need you back in position immediately." Scott felt torn between his professional obligations and the woman who clearly needed help that went far beyond what a stranger at a truck stop could provide. But as he looked at Latasha's face, seeing hope beginning to replace despair, he realized that sometimes the most important cases weren't the ones you were assigned. They were the ones that found you. When someone needed protection, you were uniquely qualified to provide. "Latasha," he said, "I need to be honest with you about something. I'm not just security. I'm a detective with the Houston Police Department. I was here tonight on an unrelated case, but what you've told me about your situation, it sounds like you might be the victim of a conspiracy that goes beyond business competition." The revelation should have felt like betrayal, but instead, Latasha felt relief flooding through her. "You're a cop." "Undercover detective," Scott confirmed, "and I have a daughter who depends on me making good decisions about who deserves protection and who deserves investigation." As the storm continued to rage around them, Scott realized he was facing a choice that would define not just his professional priorities, but his understanding of what it meant to serve and protect people who'd been targeted by predators wealthy enough to avoid traditional law enforcement. Latasha looked at this man who'd approached her with kindness and was now offering expertise she desperately needed, wondering if she'd finally found someone who saw her strength rather than her vulnerability, her worth rather than her wealth, her need for partnership rather than her capacity for independent success. The question hanging between them was whether Scott would risk his current case to help her fight for what she'd built, and whether Latasha would trust someone whose profession required him to uncover secrets, while she'd spent her adult life protecting the vulnerabilities that made her human. Scott's phone continued buzzing with increasingly urgent messages from his partner as he faced the most difficult professional decision of his career. The drug operation he'd been tracking for months was finally about to unfold, but the woman sitting beside him represented a different kind of case, one that involved corporate conspiracy rather than street-level crime. "I have to go," Scott said reluctantly, showing Latasha the messages demanding his immediate return to surveillance. "But this conversation isn't over. What you've described sounds like criminal conspiracy, and if that's true, you need law enforcement protection." Latasha felt panic rising as her lifeline prepared to disappear into the storm. "Wait, please. I know you have other responsibilities, but I don't know who else to trust. If my board is really conspiring against me, then everyone in my professional circle could be compromised." Scott looked at her face, seeing the fear she was trying to hide beneath her composed exterior. His phone buzzed again, his partner's final warning before the operation proceeded without him. "Give me your number," he said quickly. "I'll call you as soon as I can get away, and we'll figure out how to protect both you and your company." As they exchanged contact information, neither realized they were being watched from across the parking lot. A man in a dark sedan had been photographing their interaction with a telephoto lens, documenting what would later be characterized as a clandestine meeting between Latasha Hawkins and an unidentified associate. "Scott," Latasha said as he prepared to leave, "thank you for believing me. I haven't had anyone in my corner for a long time." "You're not alone anymore," Scott replied with conviction that surprised them both. "Whatever's happening to your business, we'll figure it out together." 3 hours later, Scott sat in a police interview room, facing internal affairs investigators whose questions had nothing to do with the drug operation he'd just helped conclude successfully. "Detective Turner," said Lieutenant Patricia Morse, her expression carrying the particular seriousness that accompanied career-threatening investigations, "we need to discuss your activities earlier this evening." Scott felt cold recognition settling in his chest. "What activities?" Lieutenant Morse slid a folder across the table, revealing photographs of Scott and Latasha at the truck stop, images that had been taken with professional equipment and captured from angles that suggested deliberate surveillance. "These photographs were delivered to our office 2 hours ago, along with an anonymous tip that you've been meeting with Latasha Hawkins in connection with an ongoing investigation into her business practices," Morse explained. Scott stared at the images, realizing that someone had been watching them, documenting their interaction for purposes that were now becoming clear. "Lieutenant, I can explain." "Detective Turner, are you conducting an unauthorized investigation into Hawkins' logistics?" Morse interrupted. "No," Scott said firmly. "I encountered Ms. Hawkins by chance while conducting surveillance on an unrelated case. She was in distress, and I offered assistance as any officer would." "Assistance that involved a 3-hour conversation in your personal vehicle?" Morse consulted her notes. "According to the surveillance report, you abandoned your assigned position to spend the entire evening with Ms. Hawkins." Scott felt the walls closing in as he recognized the sophistication of whatever trap had been set around both him and Latasha. "Lieutenant, what surveillance report? Who was conducting surveillance on my surveillance?" "That's classified information related to an ongoing investigation," Morse replied. "What I need from you is a complete account of your interaction with Ms. Hawkins, including any information she may have shared about her business operations." The questions continued for 2 hours, with Scott providing careful answers that protected Latasha while acknowledging the basic facts of their encounter. But as the interview concluded, he realized that someone with significant resources and legal sophistication had orchestrated this situation to neutralize him as a potential threat to whatever was being planned against Latasha's company. Meanwhile, Latasha sat in her downtown office at 6 a.m., staring at documents that confirmed her worst fears about the conspiracy targeting her business. Her assistant had discovered irregularities in the contract termination from Meridian Shipping, legal language that suggested the decision had been influenced by third parties offering more favorable terms to Meridian's management. "Ms. Hawkins," said her assistant Janet Ray, "there's something else. I received a call from a reporter at the Business Chronicle asking for comment about your personal relationship with law enforcement officials and whether it represents a conflict of interest given your company's government contracts." Latasha felt her stomach drop. What personal relationship? Janet handed her a printed email containing the same photographs that had been delivered to the police department. These were sent to several media outlets with suggestions that you're under criminal investigation and using personal connections to influence the outcome. Latasha stared at images of herself and Scott at the truck stop, seeing how their innocent conversation could be twisted into evidence of impropriety. Whoever was orchestrating the attack on her company had now drawn Scott into their crosshairs as well. "Janet, I need you to cancel all my appointments today," Latasha said. "And I need you to research every connection between our board members, Meridian Shipping, and any of our major competitors." As Janet left to execute these instructions, Latasha's phone rang with a call from Harrison Wells, the board member who demanded the emergency meeting. "Latasha," Wells said, his voice carrying false sympathy, "I'm calling to express concern about the photographs that are circulating. The board is worried that your personal conduct may be affecting your judgment as CEO." "What photographs, Harrison?" Latasha asked, though she already knew. "Images of you meeting with what appears to be a law enforcement officer in highly unusual circumstances, combined with the recent business losses and your condition. The board feels this raises serious questions about your fitness for leadership." Latasha recognized the careful language of someone building a legal case for her removal. "Harrison, that meeting was completely innocent. I was in distress and a stranger offered help." "I'm sure there's an innocent explanation," Wells replied with the tone of someone who didn't believe a word of it. "But perception matters in business, and the perception that our CEO is involved in some kind of investigation or scandal could devastate our remaining client relationships." After ending the call, Latasha realized that the trap closing around her was more sophisticated than simple business competition. Someone had orchestrated a multi-pronged attack designed to destroy her reputation, isolate her from allies, and create legal justification for seizing control of her company. Her phone buzzed with a text from Scott. "Can't talk on phone, being watched. Meet me at Emma's school at 3 p.m. Playground behind building. Come alone and make sure you're not followed." What would you do if trying to help someone led to both of you being targeted by enemies with resources and connections you never imagined? Sometimes the most dangerous conspiracies are the ones that use the system itself as a weapon against people who threaten established power. The cryptic message confirmed Latasha's fears that Scott was also under threat because of their association, but it also offered hope. He hadn't abandoned her despite the professional risks, and his law enforcement experience might be their only chance of exposing the conspiracy before it destroyed everything they both valued. As Latasha prepared for what might be the most important meeting of her life, she realized that the truck stop encounter had connected her to someone who understood that some battles were worth fighting regardless of personal cost, and that sometimes the people who saved you were the ones who were brave enough to risk everything when principle demanded action. The question now was whether two people who'd built their lives on independence and self-reliance could learn to trust each other enough to fight enemies who were using their isolation as a weapon against them. At 2:45 p.m., Latasha sat in her car outside Roosevelt Elementary School, watching for surveillance while trying to process how her successful life had transformed into something resembling a crime thriller. But as she spotted Scott approaching the playground where children's laughter provided cover for conversations that adults shouldn't need to have, she felt something she hadn't experienced since her foster care days. The recognition that survival sometimes required allies, even when trusting others felt like the most dangerous thing you could do. Roosevelt Elementary's playground buzzed with the afternoon energy of children whose biggest concerns were swing-set territories and who got picked first for kickball. Scott stood near the jungle gym, his eyes constantly scanning for surveillance while trying to appear like any other parent picking up their child. When he spotted Latasha approaching, he felt both relief and deepening concern. She looked like someone who hadn't slept, whose world was collapsing faster than she could process. "Thank you for coming," Scott said quietly as she joined him near the monkey bars. "I wasn't sure you'd risk it." "I wasn't sure I had a choice," Latasha replied, noting how Scott positioned himself to watch both entrances to the playground. "How much trouble are you in because of me?" "Enough that I'm probably about to end my career," Scott said matter-of-factly. "But I've spent the last 12 hours doing research that you need to see." He pulled out a folder he'd been carrying casually, opening it to reveal documents that looked like they'd been compiled through official law enforcement channels. "Harrison Wells, your board member who's pushing for your removal," Scott began, "has financial connections to Meridian Shipping that he never disclosed. His investment firm holds significant equity in their parent company." Latasha felt her breath catch. "That's a massive conflict of interest. If he influenced their decision to terminate our contract." "It gets worse," Scott continued. "Two other board members have recently received consulting contracts from competitors who would benefit from Hawkins Logistics failing. And the law firm handling Meridian's contract termination has been retained by the same group of investors who've been trying to buy distressed logistics companies across Texas." The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Latasha realized she wasn't just facing business competition. She was the target of a coordinated takeover attempt orchestrated by people she'd trusted with her company's governance. "How did you get this information?" she asked. "I called in favors with financial crimes investigators who owe me from previous cases," Scott replied. "But doing that research under my own credentials means there's now an official trail connecting me to your situation." Before Latasha could respond, Scott's phone buzzed with a call from a number he didn't recognize. Against his better judgment, he answered. "Detective Turner," said a voice he didn't recognize. "My name is Marcus Davidson, and I represent certain business interests that have been monitoring your recent activities." Scott felt ice in his veins. "Who is this?" "Someone who can make your problems disappear, or make them much worse," Davidson replied smoothly. "Ms. Hawkins is standing beside you, I assume? Please put me on speaker." Scott looked at Latasha, whose face had gone pale as she realized their meeting had been compromised. With no good alternatives, he complied with the request. "Ms. Hawkins," Davidson's voice carried through the phone with calculated authority, "you're facing a choice that will determine not just your company's future, but Detective Turner's career and his daughter's well-being." The mention of Emma made Scott's protective instincts flare with dangerous intensity. "If you threaten my daughter—" "No threats, Detective Turner. Just clarity about consequences," Davidson interrupted. "Ms. Hawkins can end this entire situation by voluntarily resigning as CEO and transferring her shares to a management group that's prepared to offer fair compensation for her holdings." "What kind of compensation?" Latasha asked, though her tone suggested she already understood she was being extorted. $50 million for your complete stake in Hawkins Logistics, plus a confidentiality agreement that ensures this transition remains private," Davidson replied. "Alternatively, the evidence we've compiled about your relationship with Detective Turner becomes public, your board votes you out tomorrow, and the company enters bankruptcy proceedings that will leave you with nothing." Scott felt fury building as he recognized the sophisticated extortion scheme targeting Latasha. And if she refuses, then Detective Turner faces internal affairs charges for conducting unauthorized investigations, using department resources for personal benefit, and potentially accepting bribes from a subject of interest, Davidson explained matter-of-factly. His daughter Emma becomes the child of a disgraced former police officer who'll find it difficult to maintain his current custody arrangement. The threat was perfectly calculated, attacking Scott through his vulnerability as a single father, while simultaneously pressuring Latasha through her concern for someone who'd tried to help her. "You have until tomorrow morning to decide," Davidson continued. "The board meeting is scheduled for 10 a.m. Ms. Hawkins can attend as CEO announcing her voluntary resignation or as a defendant in corporate misconduct proceedings." The call ended, leaving Scott and Latasha standing on a playground where children played innocently, while adults negotiated the destruction of everything they'd built to protect the people they loved. "Scott," Latasha said quietly, "I can't let them destroy your career because you helped me. I'll take their offer." "No," Scott said firmly. Giving in to extortion doesn't make it stop. It just proves you can be controlled. But Emma needs her father to be someone who fights for what's right, even when it's difficult, Scott replied, his voice carrying conviction that had been forged through years of dangerous work. And right now, fighting for what's right means exposing these people before they can do to other successful women what they're trying to do to you. Latasha looked at this man who was willing to risk everything for principles that transcended personal safety, seeing courage that reminded her why she'd fought so hard to build something meaningful in the first place. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "I need you to trust me," Scott said, "and I need you to be willing to fight back, even if it means risking everything you've built." As they stood together in the fading afternoon light, surrounded by the sounds of childhood innocence that both were fighting to protect, his daughter's future, her unborn child's inheritance, Scott and Latasha realized they were facing enemies who used wealth and connections as weapons against people who threatened their control. "There's something else," Scott said, pulling out his phone to show her a text he'd received an hour earlier. "Someone contacted Child Protective Services, claiming that my undercover work creates an unsafe environment for Emma. They're scheduling a home visit tomorrow." The final piece of the extortion fell into place. Their enemies weren't just attacking their professional lives, they were weaponizing the systems meant to protect families, using Scott's devotion to his daughter and Latasha's pregnancy as pressure points to force compliance. "They're not just trying to steal my company," Latasha said with growing recognition. "They're trying to destroy anyone who might help me fight back." "Then we fight back tonight," Scott said, his voice carrying the controlled intensity of someone who'd reached the point where retreat was no longer an option, before they can execute whatever they have planned for tomorrow. As evening shadows stretched across the playground, where their children's futures hung in the balance, Scott and Latasha prepared to discover whether two people who'd learned to survive through independence could combine their strengths to defeat enemies who'd underestimated what happened when someone with nothing left to lose partnered with someone who understood that some battles were worth any price. The question now was whether a single father cop and a pregnant CEO had enough courage, resources, and allies to expose a conspiracy designed by people who believed wealth and connections made them untouchable. 8 months later, Scott pushed Emma's stroller through the sun-dappled paths of Herman Park, while Latasha walked beside them, her 3-month-old son Marcus sleeping peacefully in her arms. The man who'd once conducted surveillance from unmarked cars now served as head of corporate security for Hawkins Logistics, while the woman who'd sat crying in a rain-soaked truck stop had emerged stronger from her trials, leading a company that had not only survived but thrived in the aftermath of the conspiracy's exposure. "Daddy," 7-year-old Emma said, pointing toward the park's playground, "can we show Marcus the swings when he gets bigger?" "Of course, sweetheart," Scott replied, smiling at his daughter's protective affection for the baby who'd become like a brother to her. "But we'll have to wait until he can hold his head up on his own." The domestic scene would have been impossible to imagine 9 months ago, when Scott and Latasha were strangers whose lives intersected during their respective moments of crisis. Now they were a family forged not through conventional romance, but through the shared understanding that came from fighting battles that revealed character more clearly than years of normal courtship could have accomplished. "The sentencing hearing is next week," Latasha said, referring to the final legal proceedings against Harrison Wells and his co-conspirators. "Harrison's attorney is still trying to negotiate a plea deal. After everything he put you through, I hope he gets the maximum sentence," Scott replied, his voice carrying the controlled anger of someone who'd witnessed the human cost of corporate greed. The conspiracy's unraveling had been swift once Scott and Latasha decided to fight back. Using his law enforcement connections and her business expertise, they'd gathered evidence that revealed a pattern of targeting successful minority-owned businesses for hostile takeovers disguised as market failures. Harrison Wells, Marcus Davidson, and 6 other defendants now faced federal charges for securities fraud, conspiracy, and extortion. "The important thing is that other business owners won't face what I faced," Latasha said. "The FBI task force your investigation inspired has already prevented 3 similar conspiracies." Scott squeezed her free hand, remembering the night they'd stayed up until dawn, compiling evidence while Emma slept on Latasha's couch, and their unborn child moved restlessly in response to his mother's stress. "I still can't believe Internal Affairs tried to make you testify against me. I still can't believe you were willing to resign rather than let them force me to," Latasha replied. "That's when I knew you were different from every other man I'd ever met." The memory was painful, but precious. The moment when Scott had chosen her well-being over his career security, proving that his protective instincts extended beyond professional duty to genuine care for her as a person, rather than as a case to be solved. "Look, Mama Tasha," Emma called out, using the name she'd insisted on despite Latasha's protests that she wasn't technically Emma's stepmother yet. "The ducks have babies." Latasha smiled at the child who'd accepted her into their family with the generous heart that had made Scott fall in love with fatherhood. "Should we bring them some crackers next time we visit?" "Yes, and we can bring Marcus when he's big enough to see them too." The easy acceptance still amazed Latasha, who'd spent her childhood moving between foster families that never quite felt like home. Emma's immediate inclusion of both her and baby Marcus had taught her what unconditional love looked like when it wasn't complicated by adult fears about vulnerability and loss. "Latasha," Scott said as they found a bench overlooking the park's lake, "there's something I've been wanting to discuss with you." "Should I be worried?" she asked, noting the careful tone that suggested important conversation rather than casual remarks. Scott pulled a small velvet box from his jacket pocket, his actions watched with obvious interest by Emma, who'd been anticipating this moment for weeks. "Latasha Hawkins," Scott began, his voice carrying the same conviction that had characterized his decision to help a stranger in a truck stop parking lot. "You're the strongest, most courageous person I've ever met. You've shown me that love isn't about finding someone who makes life easier. It's about finding someone who makes you want to be brave enough to build something beautiful together." Latasha felt tears gathering in her eyes as she realized what was happening in this park, where families created memories that would last lifetimes. "You've made me understand that real partnership means showing up for each other when life gets complicated, not just when it's convenient," Scott continued. "You've taught Emma what it looks like when a woman leads with both strength and compassion, and you've given us both a son who represents the future we're building together." He opened the box to reveal a ring that was elegant but not ostentatious, chosen to honor her success without overshadowing her accomplishments. "Will you marry me? Will you let us be a family officially, legally, permanently? Do you believe that the best love stories begin not with perfect circumstances, but with people who choose to face imperfect circumstances together? Sometimes the greatest romance is found not in fairy tale meetings, but in the courage to build something real from the wreckage of broken dreams." "Yes," Latasha said without hesitation, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who'd learned to recognize authentic love when it appeared in unexpected forms. "Yes, Scott Turner, I will marry you." As he slipped the ring onto her finger while baby Marcus slept peacefully in her other arm, Emma cheered with the uninhibited joy of a child whose family had just become officially complete. "Now we're all together forever," Emma declared with 7-year-old authority. "Daddy and Mama Tasha and baby Marcus and me." 6 months later, their wedding took place in the same park where Scott had proposed, with Emma serving as maid of honor and baby Marcus sleeping through the ceremony in his father's arms during the exchange of vows. The guest list included patrol officers who'd become friends, business leaders who'd become allies, and foster care workers who'd celebrated Latasha's journey from homeless teenager to successful entrepreneur to beloved family member. But perhaps the most meaningful presence was Mrs. Rodriguez, Scott's neighbor, who'd watched Emma during countless nights when single fatherhood had stretched his resources thin, and who now served as honorary grandmother to both children, proving that family was built through love and commitment rather than blood and legal documents. As Scott and Latasha danced to their first song as husband and wife, while their children played with wedding guests who'd become extended family, they reflected on the journey that had brought them from strangers in a storm to partners in building a life that honored both their individual strengths and their shared values. Hawkins Logistics had expanded into new markets under Latasha's leadership, But more importantly, it had become a model for ethical business practices that prioritized employee welfare and community investment, alongside profit generation. Scott's transition from undercover detective to corporate security director had allowed him to use his investigative skills while maintaining the regular schedule that fatherhood required. Most significantly, their children were growing up understanding that families came in many forms, that love was demonstrated through actions rather than words, and that the greatest security came not from wealth or status, but from knowing that the people who claimed to love you would stand beside you when life demanded courage rather than comfort. As the evening wound down and they prepared to begin their honeymoon, a weekend at a nearby resort while Emma stayed with Mrs. Rodriguez and baby Marcus traveled with them, Latasha looked at the man who'd approached her during her darkest moment and offered help without knowing anything about her except that she needed assistance. "Scott," she said as they swayed together under lights strung between park trees, "do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't stopped that night?" "Every day," Scott replied honestly. "But not because I regret it, because I'm grateful that sometimes the most important decisions we make are the ones that feel like no choice at all." Their love story had begun in a parking lot during a thunderstorm, but it had grown into something that could weather any storm because it was built on the foundation of people who'd learned that the greatest strength came from choosing to be vulnerable with someone who proved worthy of that trust. As they drove home to begin their life as an officially married family, Scott and Latasha knew that their future would bring challenges they couldn't predict. But they also knew they'd face those challenges together, two people who'd learned that the best partnerships were forged not in perfect circumstances, but in the crucible of real life, where love was proven through action and families were built through the daily choice to show up for each other, regardless of what the world might demand. Their children would grow up understanding that heroes weren't just people in uniforms or corner offices, but anyone brave enough to help a stranger in need, and that the greatest inheritance parents could leave wasn't money or status, but the knowledge that love and courage could triumph over any conspiracy designed to separate people who belonged together.